The defendant walked into the courtroom with an expression that immediately caught everyone's attention. Unlike most people who enter that solemn space with nervous glances and anxious energy, the defendant carried themselves with the swagger of someone who believed the outcome was already in their favor. From the tilt of the chin to the confident grin that never left their face, the defendant projected an attitude of superiority, as though the rules of the court applied to everyone else but not to them. As the bailiff called the room to order and the judge entered, the defendant leaned back casually, arms crossed, scanning the courtroom with a look of amusement. While others sat upright, tense and respectful, the defendant looked more like a spectator at a comedy show than someone facing the weight of justice. From the very beginning, the arrogance was impossible to miss, and those sitting in the gallery exchanged subtle glances that seemed to say, "This is not going to end well." As the hearing unfolded, the defendant's behavior only reinforced those first impressions. Each time the charges were read, the defendant smirked and shook their head, dismissing the seriousness of the accusations. When the prosecutor presented evidence, the defendant whispered comments under their breath, rolled their eyes dramatically, and even chuckled outright as though the entire process were beneath consideration. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some frowning at the display of disrespect, while the prosecutor's frustration became more and more visible. Still, the defendant pressed on, oblivious or unwilling to recognize the growing tension in the room. To the defendant, this was a stage, and every reaction was a performance designed to show that they were untouchable. What they did not realize was that the judge, calm and experienced, was taking in every detail. Judges are trained observers of human behavior, and this judge was no exception. Every sarcastic gesture, every smirk, every careless remark was being carefully noted, even as the defendant convinced themselves that their actions were being ignored. The breaking point came when the defendant, in a moment of blatant disrespect, laughed out loud during a critical moment in the testimony. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom, and gasps rippled through the gallery. A juror shook their head in disbelief, and the bailiff instinctively straightened, ready to intervene if necessary. The laughter lasted only a second, but its impact lingered heavily in the room. When the judge raised their eyes to meet the defendants, the weight of that gaze was unmistakable. For the first time, the defendants' grin flickered, their posture stiffened slightly, and a faint unease crossed their face. The courtroom had shifted. No longer was it a space for arrogance. It had become a stage where the defendant's own behavior was on trial just as much as the evidence. Still, the defendant clung to the belief that the verdict would be lenient. Perhaps a fine, perhaps community service. Something small, something survivable. That confidence was evident in the way the defendant leaned back once more, tapping their fingers impatiently as though waiting for an inevitable outcome. But when the time for judgment arrived, everything changed. The judge leaned forward, their voice calm, yet carrying the weight of absolute authority. With measured words, the judge outlined the facts of the case, but just as importantly, the judge spoke directly to the defendant's conduct, the arrogance, the laughter, the interruptions, the complete disregard for the solemnity of the court. One by one, the judge listed these offenses, not as minor disruptions, but as clear evidence of a lack of respect, not only for the court, but for the law itself. The defendant's smirk vanished completely as the words cut through the illusion of control. Then came the moment no one had expected. The judge delivered a sentence far harsher than anticipated, a punishment that reflected not only the crime, but the arrogance with which the defendant had carried themselves throughout the trial. Murmurs spread across the gallery as the weight of the decision sank in. The prosecutor gave a small, satisfied nod, while the bailiff stepped forward, prepared to carry out the court's orders. The defendant, however, sat frozen in disbelief. The confident swagger, the smug grin, the casual disrespect, all of it evaporated in an instant. For the first time, the defendant appeared vulnerable, stripped of the arrogance that had defined their every move since stepping into the room. The silence that followed was almost as powerful as the verdict itself. It was the silence of realization. The silence of a lesson learned the hardest possible way. The defendant had walked into the courtroom believing it was a place they could mock, a stage on which they could perform, but they were leaving it as a sobering reminder that justice demands respect. The defendant, once so sure of victory, now understood the truth. In the courtroom, arrogance is not a shield but a liability, and justice always has the final word.